Welcome to Real Health with me, Karl Henry. Folks, can smelling, touching and seeing nature directly improve our physical and our mental health? In her new book, Good Nature, Professor of Biodiversity at University of Oxford, Kathy Willis, reveals the cutting-edge research about the benefits of bringing nature into our lives. Kathy, welcome to Real Health. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
I'm delighted to see plants and nature in your background as I chat to you here. There's plants in the room, which is a good thing. What made you write the book? I'm fascinated about this. It's really interesting.
Well, it is interesting. And the plants in the background weren't there when I started writing this book, but I became a convert as I followed it through. And I'm not a sort of woo-woo scientist. I'm not some sort of mad plant lady. When I started writing this book, it's because I was doing a big piece of work for a big international project looking at ecosystem services, the benefits we get from different aspects of nature. And in there, I kept coming across this study published in 1984, which said that people who were recovering from a gallbladder operation in hospital, if they looked out their hospital window onto trees, they recovered 3 times faster and took less pain relief drugs than those who looked onto a brick wall. And I thought it was really interesting because it suggests that something just to do with looking can directly trigger actions in our bodies that make you recover faster. And it was published in this top journal called Science. So it wasn't some sort of weird, out on the edge science journal or a journal of any sort. And so I started to look at this. And when I started to look at this, I kept coming across all these studies looking at the different senses of sight, sound, smell, touch, and what happens when we interact with nature. There's a direct automatic change, or there are direct automatic change that occur in our body as a result, and they trigger all these physiological and psychological changes that improve our health. And that's really this book is my journey of trying to understand this whole new medical language, and all these studies that have been published in the last 10 to 15 years that's moved the idea of interacting with nature, like, oh, it's nice, fluffy bunnies, pretty flowers, but actually doesn't really have any effect, to coming right the way through to saying, gosh, this really does impact our health and can be an incredible sort of additional tool in the armory to prevent us getting ill in the first place, but when we're ill, helping us recover from those symptoms.
And was this always something that you've been interested in? Was it always something that academically you were involved in, or what did you study before you began to research this?
No, not at all. So I originally started as a paleoecologist, which is a term that absolutely draws a blank when you say it at a party. People have no idea what you're talking about. But it was a fascinating study. It still is a topic where you use fossil plants and plant macrofossils that are contained in like sedimentary sequences like lake sediments. You extract them to look at vegetation changes through time in response to climate change, for example. So really relevant if you're trying to model future climate change and vegetation change. But I did that for a number of years and did a lot on the evolution of plants. And then I moved as Director of Science to the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. And there I was responsible for like 380 scientists and the most incredible global collections, but again, all slightly dead. Because they're all, the herbarium or the fungarium. These are basically dead plant parts, sort of squashed between papers and stuff. But brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But when I was there, I started to do these larger projects like State of the World's Plants. And it was there that I started to do this work on thinking about this relationship between nature and health. And I mean, at the time I didn't realise it, but every lunchtime, it was quite a stressful job. I was there 5 years, and it was just one of those jobs which like full on from the minute you walked in the door till the time you went home. And I used to just take half an hour every lunchtime, and as anyone does, you go walking or just go up to the shops in the local area, local village. Or I would walk around the grounds. And what I did find is when I walked around Kew Gardens, I was always much calmer when I got back to my office than if I'd walked on the road up to the shops. And I didn't really reflect on it at the time. But once I started to look at the science behind, if you walk on a street for 15 minutes, compared same pace, same everything else, but in a park for 15 minutes, physiologically and psychologically, you're much calmer if you walk around the park. So your blood pressure is lower, your heart rate is lower, your breathing slows down, your hormones, your stress hormones become reduced if you walk in the park, but you don't get the same effect if you walk on the street. Or that's all the clinical studies that have been done so far show this really big difference. Even that small tweak about where you walk at lunchtime can really change the health benefits you get from that walk.
And obviously nature is driving that, but is there a reason that those concrete environments are so much worse for our health? Do we know?
It's a number of things, really extraordinary things. First of all, there's sight. So it would seem that our brainwave, the way our brain, that when you look at sort of neural activity in the brain and you look at people who view like a office, let's say a New York horizon, and you see all of those tall, square buildings. If you look at that compared to if you look at a forest on your screensaver, when you're looking at the forest, the areas of the brainwave activity, the alpha brainwave, is enhanced when you look at the forest rather than at the horizon of a city. And that triggers the sort of physiological and psychological relaxation, or this is one of the pathways that's thought to be triggered at that point. And to me, I find that extraordinary. And then when the further work they've done is it's also to do with the fractal dimension of the landscape, which sounds really weird. But when we scan a landscape, our eyes don't just look at the overall landscape. They start to pick out the fractal dimension, the number of times that pattern on the horizon can divide it into the pattern, so that nature is naturally got many fractal dimensions to it. You think of a tree with branches, and then you look through the branches, you see the smaller branches. They're the same pattern, but they're smaller. Go on through, you've got the twigs. Go on through, you've got the twiglets. And it's the same thing. So the more time it divides, the greater the fractal dimension. And they found that actually the human brain is the alpha brain waves are most enhanced at this mid-fractal dimension, which when you convert that to a landscape is a more open green landscape with a few scattered trees on it.
Wow.
Now, some people have taken it one step further and said, that's because we evolved out of Africa and that's a savanna landscape where you get those, acacia trees and open landscape. I don't go there because people sit on both sides of the fence with that. But the point being, and I think it's the outcome we want to look at, that if you look at a more open green landscape with scattered trees on it, you will get more physiological and psychological calming than if you look on a horizon that's got these very tall buildings and very, very stark square edges to it. So there's that sort of aspect which I think is just extraordinary.
So is it fair to say that we've become divorced from nature in the world that we live in, that there's less and less of it? Like as I walk out of the studio today, I walk into concrete, I walk into buses, I walk into noise. I think there might be a tree somewhere along the line, but we've become very much disconnected from nature.
Yeah, and I think this is where I think there's some really, really interesting population level studies coming through, which show there was a study. This is one study, but there are many of them. There was a study carried out which published last year in Lancet, so in a really top medical journal, and they looked at 10 years of population data from Wales, and they looked at 2.3 million people, and they looked at their medical records for common mental diseases. And then they mapped those people and where they lived, their geolocation, against how close they were to green space. So urban green park, let's say. And they showed that for every 350 meters they were further away from living near to green space, they had worse mental health outcomes. And it's a really robust data set. But also the very interesting thing is that it was even more pronounced in the people who are basically worse off, sort of socioeconomically, the lowest quintile in terms of socioeconomic deprivation. People who lived in those who were basically had, in the poorest districts, they got the most benefits from living close to green space. So to me, now this is a correlation, not a causation, but I think it very much comes back to the point you've just made, that the more you divorce people from nature in cities, for whatever reason, people are worse off in terms of physical and mental well-being. Now, that's one study. That's 2.3 million. I could give you about another 10 studies that have been published like this from all over the world. So we have to listen to this. This data is really, really powerful in saying if we take nature out of our cities or out of the areas we live in, then we seem to have this whole swathe of diseases that are, and these are the non-communicable ones, like the ones that are linked through to anxiety, through to stress, through the cancers, etc. And we have to look at prevention. We also have to look at protecting people and building their resilience to these diseases. And by divorcing people from nature, we're creating really big problems for ourselves. And what I find really odd is we have this public health message that we should all eat 30 plants a week. So we're sort of all in tune with eating nature, but we're not in tune with actually needing to interact with nature. And one of the other studies, or a whole swathe of studies that I've talked about in this book, are to do with smell, because smell is one of the senses that we just sort of ignore. I did. I think, pretty nice smell of a plant, you breathe it in, you breathe it out, that's it. But when you breathe in a plant smell, the compounds that make that smell are these volatile organic compounds, which means that they're a molecule that when they hit the air, the gas expands, it gives off that smell. When we breathe that smell in, some of those molecules pass across our lung membrane into our blood. So we effectively are taking nature into our bodies. And when it gets into our blood, those molecules have been shown, some of those plant smells interact with the same biochemical pathways as if you're taking a prescription drug. So lavender, it does make you sleepier. It makes you more calm and relaxed. Rosemary, it triggers a biochemical pathway that makes you more alert. And then one, which is the cypress family and the cedar trees, there's some extraordinary data coming through there that when you spend time in those forests or smelling those smells, you end up with, first of all, lower adrenaline hormone in your blood, so you're calmer, but also it elevates the natural killer cells in your blood. Now, the natural killer cells are the cells we all want because those are the ones that attack cancers and viruses. So it's giving your body an enhanced sort of resilience to some of the things that will attack our bodies. And so I think there's a vast new set of data out there, it has been coming through in the clinical records, and many of these studies are done in clinical studies, and the biochemists have been looking at it. But to link that back through to what nature do we need in our homes, in our cities, why is it absolutely critical that when we think about building the cities of the now and the future, we don't think nature is an add-on, a luxury that we can't afford. We need nature much, much more in cities than we think.
And where do we, you're presenting the evidence. The evidence is staggering. It's mind-blowing. And it's brilliant to get you on to be able to tell people all about it, which is great. And where do you start? Is it as simple as doing what you've done there? We were saying before you came on air, I think, in terms of putting the plants into your office space. Is it that simple? Obviously, It extends to trees around you and getting out in nature and so on and so forth. But does it start as simply as that?
It does. I think it's never too late to start. And I think you can make small change in your own life and your own day-to-day actions, tiny changes that can already make a big difference. So my study at home now and my house at home is the number of plants has multiplied. And these are house plants. I know that green and white leaf plants are really good. I bought some diffusers, very simple diffusers, and I diffuse lavender in my bedroom when I'm not all the time, but just occasionally if I can't sleep. And rosemary in my study. I have cypress oil diffusing in the house occasionally. There are those sorts of things. When I go walking at lunchtime or any other time now, I always make an effort just to actually do a detour through the park. I don't, you think, I haven't got time, I'm too busy. You have got time. You just have to make time in the same way that you'd make time to say, I'm going to eat vegetables. It's that sort of thing. So there's lots of stuff we can personally do. But on a more sort of more policy basis, we absolutely need to be lobbying the governments, our local governments, our local cities to say, no, you can't have a policy where yes, we need more houses. I'm the first person to say we need to build more houses. I agree. But it shouldn't be an either or. You're going to build houses, make sure you build houses that have got nature around them or the ability for nature to thrive around them. And you can't have a policy which just says nature is outside the city in a beautiful nature reserve and you are in an urban jungle, because but a jungle without any plants. So it's those sorts of things. And if you haven't got space for, green space, they've shown some really nice studies showing even these green walls are very, very effective at enhancing and providing benefits in cities. So I think there's much to be done here, but it starts in your own home and your own way of interacting. And anybody, they've even shown that a few pots in your front garden, if you don't have a back garden, it's fine. Actually, the pots in the front garden are in some ways for mental well-being better, because you see them every time you're going out the front door. So there are such small things you can do. But I honestly feel that we need to move nature from this sort of fluffy bunny, pretty plant area that we often put it into, as to being a critical infrastructure in our everyday lives for our physical and mental health and well-being.
Because it's something that makes us feel happier and more productive. And do you get that from the changes that you've made and those kind of micro choices, that when you do take the longer route to go somewhere through a nature area, that you feel happier as a result of that?
Happier and just much healthier. And actually, I think once you sort of read the science behind it and realize what it's doing to you internally as well, then you really start to think, actually, even in the long term, the prevention is as important as anything else. And many governments now are talking about we have to create systems which actually prevent people getting these things in the first place. And the other really extraordinary chapter, which was something I was very, very cynical about. I do tend to kick the tires quite hard as a scientist and then get others to do the same for me. And that was to do with the environmental microbiome. We're all hearing so much about our gut bacteria. And what the evidence is showing, it's been shown for a couple of years now, that actually when you interact in a more biodiverse area, your gut adopts the signature of the environment it's in.
Go away.
And if you're in the biodiverse environment, you end up with all this good bacteria in the gut, the sort of bacteria that you want. We're all being told we should drink probiotic drinks to increase it. And so they did this lovely study where they had 3 groups of nursery school children in Finland. It was a brilliant study published in a top science journal. And they put soil from the boreal forest in one of the kindergarten playgrounds. The second one just had matting, rubber matting, and the third one had concrete. And they looked at the children's gut flora in their poo, basically, after 28 days. And they also looked at their bloods, because, of course, there's always a thing. If you change your gut flora, does it change your inflammatory markers? And they found after 28 days, the children who played in the soil had a totally different and diverse gut flora to the other 2 groups. Not only that, they had statistically significant reduction in the inflammatory markers in their bloods.
Wow. And so, is that airborne or?
Yeah. So what's happening is and they've shown this with adults as well. When you garden, if you garden without your gloves on, or when you're just touching soil or plants, your skin picks up the microbiome that's in there, the bacteria around, and you think about how can you touch your mouth and everything else. And also they've shown people who walk in above a biodiverse park, if they swab their noses, they find they've got all the good bacteria in their nose. They've breathed it in, so it passes down into your gut.
Wow, my goodness. Wow.
So it's and even having a spider plant on your desk, they've shown they put this soul spider plant in a room, and they sort of sealed the room. And 8 weeks later, it's a room that's completely cleaned. 8 weeks later, they came back, and this single spider plant, it had basically seeded the room with good bacteria, like the walls, the ceiling, the floor. And so again, you can see that it's all of these things that we absolutely know and that the science is showing that we really want to improve our gut flora. We want to, all these things we want to do. And by interacting with nature, you can start to do these things without having to rely on a whole swathe of drugs and potions.
And of course, the gut bacteria then ties into the prevalence of obesity that we're seeing, but also the lack of nature ties into that too. I know there was a feature in The Guardian recently around this in terms of childhood obesity and with the lack of exposure to nature and rising levels. And the gut flora would tie into that too, obviously.
So it's really interesting. There's a study published in Oncology, so OncoTarget. It's one of the top cancer journals, which looked at people who walked in this hinoki, the Japanese cypress forest. And they also looked at the population that lived near to it, the population who actually lived in it. Their houses were surrounded by it. And they did show that there was a difference in obesity and diabetes in those different groups. But of course, again, we have to be really careful here that there's correlation and there's causation. Mm-hmm. And the science needs to be a whole new swathe of science and a whole new area of science on this to take this to the point where you can actually link those two together. But the relationship between obesity, particularly childhood obesity, and green space, and saying it's because people do more exercise because they've got area to exercise, mm-hmm. that is not robust and not mm-hmm. strong, at least from the reading I've been doing. And so you have to start to look for other things associated with that green space to understand, is it something to do with the nature in that green space that is providing us with these health benefits? And from the evidence I've pulled together in this book, Good Nature, I think there is a really big emerging field of science here to demonstrate this. And the Japanese, to give them absolutely the 100% credit here, they have been doing this for 10, 15 years with forest bathing. If you're in Japan, they have a whole department where they prescribe people to go and sit in the forest for 2 hours because they find it's more effective than particular prescription drugs for some conditions. Now, the question is, can you bring the effects of something like forest bathing, where they don't know if it's sight, sound, smell, but they've got a pretty good idea? Can you bring that into your own home? Can you bring that into your city? And that's the question, really, that I started off with and I explored in this book. And by the end, I'm doing the last chapter. I mean, as a scientist, you're not very good at talking about what you do yourself. But by the last chapter, I had to say, it's changed the way I interact with nature. I would always viewed it as an academic subject. And now I view it as something that's much more close to sort of a health choice as well.
You do realise when I go home, I'm going to start ordering plants on Amazon as a result of our conversation. And we'll come back into studio the next time and it'll be like an Amazonian forest. You've sold it. Absolutely sold it. I mean, we moved down to West Cork, which is like down in like rural Ireland. Yeah. Like that we're surrounded by trees, grass. I go out and walk in the grass barefoot in the morning. And am I happier? Absolutely. Yeah. At least now we have science to back that up. That it's not just in my head.
And also you don't have to even think, I'm here, it must make me happier, because it happens automatically. And that's the other thing, that what it does, I mean, there are all these systems, it triggers our nervous system, our hormone system, our psychological state, our gut microbiome, our bloods. I mean, why wouldn't you want to really start to embrace nature because of the health benefits it provides?
Chat to me finally about the key takeaways you'd like people to take for a conversation. I've taken a huge amount from it, but I always ask authors that, if there's a couple of key takeaways you would like our guests to get from it, what is it that you'd like them to get?
I think it is the fact that nature, we need to change the conversation about nature. We're still in the area that nature is something we want to protect, but we want to protect because it's rare and exotic and whatever. We want to protect it as well because nature is absolutely critical to our health and well-being. And when we become divorced from nature, that is when we bring on a whole host of health issues. And so in every aspect of your daily life, if in the same way as we're all being told to eat 30 plants a week, think about spending 3 lots of 20 minutes a week in nature, and think about every day how you're going to interact with nature in one way or another, indoors or out.
Kathy Willis, I've thoroughly enjoyed that conversation. You sold that so well with so much science that I would think myself and all of our listeners are going to go out to buy plants and look at trees in a very different way. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from Oxford. We really appreciate it. Folks, you have an excuse now to go to the garden centre or online and buy loads of plants because Kathy told us to do it. I really hope you enjoyed today's episode. It's important, it's fascinating, and it absolutely sounds like it is the future. So watch this space. As ever, you know where we are, at Karl Henry PT on Instagram, realhealth@independent.ie, and on the Irish Independent website. We will see you next week from a leafy, green Irish Independent office. Slán go fóill.